So, Paul, I'm conscious that there are people on the session today who are very familiar with your work in the Ahimsa program and your training here, but there are some people that don't know of the work and don't know about you. So could you give us a brief sense of how you came into this work, this challenging piece of work, and also just for people, again, youth with maybe a bit around the structure of the program in Ahimsa?
Oh, okay. I'm going to try and keep this very brief because I'm less interested in talking about me than about the work. But I mean, as you said, I've been basically doing the work since 1992, so not quite 30 years, but getting close to it. I got into the work initially. Basically, I got involved in a program called the Everyman Centre in Brixton in London, which was opening up working with male violence, not particularly domestic abuse, but male violence. And I guess with my own, I guess where I grew up from and the places I lived through a lot of my younger days, violence was something very present, something often not really looked at in terms of, well, how do you do something about it other than lock people up? So that got my interest, and being involved in it for a few years there, what was very striking was although many of the men were violent outside, they were pretty much all coming because they were violent in relationships. So when I moved to Plymouth, the program was set up there with a partner support service. And I need to say the partner support service at Ahimsa is integral to the work. Ahimsa isn't the male perpetrator program. It's both. It feels like they're equally important, really equally important, the work we do with each of them. Yeah, and I guess keeping it up in terms of how we work, so hopefully that will come out more in some of the questions you're asking me. But there's always been, I guess, a basic principle of looking at the work from, we've always done one-to-one and group work, done a little bit of one-to-one work before putting people in group. And the principles that guided the work of Ahimsa came out of doing the work with the men. They weren't something that we took from somewhere else. It really, the basic principles, which responsibility, emotional vulnerability, love and empathy, and creativity, came out of what actually are qualities that seem to change with the men that do change. What are the areas that seem really important? So, and of course, there's various other things leading on from that. But that's initially and we've always done fairly long program. And as I keep saying, when people say, "Can't you do it in 6 weeks?" Don't you think we would if we could? I mean, it make our life so much easier. And it's always had a therapeutic base. So it's not like everyone's got to be a therapist, but you really do need the way we work basic counseling skills because we're much more dynamic and process-led. So while we have a very clear framework, we call it guidelines. It's not a manual. It's very much the process and dynamic of working people in the room, drawing the threads that we actually want to be working with into the work. And that I'm sure will emerge much more in the conversation, hopefully.
Yeah. And maybe following up then, because you focused on qualities and this process of working with the men in group. And I'm wondering, could you say, and I think that puts quite a bit of emphasis on the qualities of facilitators, because we can have whatever content we have, whatever program structure. But one of the things I'm really struck by your work is that there is a real emphasis on what is the qualities of the facilitators and what is needed from facilitators, be they counselors or not, in the process. Could you speak to us a bit about the qualities of facilitation, the skills, and what's required for that in this work to be effective?
Yeah. And I think just to echo what you said, I'm absolutely clear. The quality and skills of the facilitator are way more important than whichever model you use. Good facilitators will end up doing good work. They'll draw the bits that are useful in a model. Poor facilitators will follow the model, and even if it's a good model, they won't necessarily do it well. So the quality of facilitation feels for us crucial and fundamental. I kind of wrote a whole page on this, just bullet points. So I'll kind of go through as much as quickly. I mean, for me, one of the essences from the approach we have, but I think this is important, is you're teaching from the inside out. You're not teaching something out there. The basic stuff you're kind of teaching, you have an understanding because you're living it. In other words, it's relevant to you in a lot of the basic principles, a lot of the areas. It's not like these are things only specific to particular human beings. These are specific to all human beings. So you've got an internal grasp of it, and it's a lived practice. And that feels, from our experience, is really, really quite essential. It also means you're much more fluid. You're not stuck on a kind of rote and rigid way of teaching. You're able to actually be much more spontaneous, much more respond to the moment, because it's in you as part of you, rather than it's a kind of compartmentalized box somewhere. That feels really, really crucial. And I mean, I always think for any facilitator, really, you've got to be interested in the work. You've got to be interested in the client. The guys, you've got to be interested in yourself, in terms of self-awareness, self-reflection. You're going to be learning stuff about yourself all the time doing this work, which is another thing. You've got to be interested in learning. There is no point you stop learning, and if there is, it's time to do something else. It's like there's not some total finality of, well, this is the absolute way to do it. Nobody knows that, including me. It's like we've got models and ways of working, but they continually can be enhanced and developed. They're not. It's not good if they're static. You've got to obviously be interested in this particular way of working, in the partner, ex-partner, and children of actually the people you're working with. But you've also got to be interested in other agencies, as opposed to finding them a pain. Even when they are a pain, you've still got to be interested. You've got, okay, I know this is important. And that kind of interest feels like really crucial. And one of the elements that I think within that would be, I talk about cultivating receptivity. It's like, I've got to, if I'm interested in the client, I've got to notice, when is he no longer receptive? Because then I can stop talking about whatever I'm talking about if it's not going in, and let's get to engage with what's happened just then. What's happened that you've switched off? What's happened that you've kind of got distracted? What's happened that you seem suddenly a little irritated and agitated? Like, so, and again, the quality of the facility means you can go there rather than, well, no, we've got to follow this line. Actually, it's what I would say an important thing of any facilitator is, I need to be able to work with what I can do and not get caught up in what I should do. And I've seen that happen so many times. So someone is actually in a reactive state and talking totally irresponsibly, and the facilitator's talking about responsibility. He's not receptive to that right now. Drop that, get him receptive, get him to deal with how his reactivity is, get him to look at that. Then you can also look at, and what's the impact of that? You're doing this in a group, it's great. You've got other guys. What was it like when Joe was in that state? So you've got all of that, yeah, which is usually very helpful because guys get to see themselves and get some mirror back from other guys. Then you can go to responsibility because now he's a little more open. But if you're just hammering away at it, it's not going anywhere. And that's, again, facilitation for me it's an art and a skill. You've really got to be, if you're going to do it well, working with people. People are not kind of stereotypes. They're all different and they all have the different responses. So that was, oh dear, what have I got over? Kind of try and keep it, yeah. I mean, the other thing I'd say with facilitators is the more you can invite a guy and question rather than tell him, the further you get. If I'm asking him the question, I'm curious, what do you make of what you've just said? Rather than telling him why what he's just said is wrong, it's a far more effective way of actually working. And in a group, you know, if he's still getting stuck in it, you go, oh, can we maybe just open it up here? I'm curious what other people are thinking. You're kind of inviting, because it also reveals much more.
Yeah.
And when I invite someone, they have no choice but to take responsibility. Even if that responsibility is to say, well, no, I'm not interested. Okay, we've got that out in the open now. You're not in. Well, that's interesting. Let's see that in the context of why you're here. You know, it's like, so that dynamic way of the inviting rather than overstating stuff. It's like teaching, really good teaching is as much about inquiry and invitation as about giving information. It's like,
Yeah, just conscious, Paul. I get really hear that. I'm conscious of the challenge. Then I think when thinking of facilitators is what you're talking about is very much a moment-to-moment process, and really, if you like, having a kind of an emptiness inside that you're really receptive and engaging and noticing what happens. I'm just conscious of the pressure that facilitators often feel around making change happen. Kind of outside the door are the the managers, the funders, the partners, and the victims. So there's quite a challenge then on the facilitators to be able to kind of keep that outside the room and be present to something that could feel quite slow or quite, so.
Well, I mean, the message I think all facilitators really need to get is you don't change people. They change themselves. What you're doing is bringing to their attention things they can either choose to look at or not. But if they're going to change, it's not going to be because you've made them change. That's an illusion. And a delusion even is really, really, really not and poor practice. So, but you see, even if someone's not engaging, this is really good information to go back to the partner. It's like, well, he's got the opportunity, but actually he's dropped out. Or we've had to terminate him. And also if he's resistant and he's there, it's a bit like we can bring the question, I'm curious, Jack, whatever, you kind of come here with these concerns, but when we start to look at them, you're going somewhere else. How do you make sense of that? I'm curious where you are with that. It's like those, so you're, rather than I've got to get in to get somewhere, because it's not helpful. It's also, if I put it really, really bluntly, we're actually, most of these guys are pushy. If we're getting pushy in the room, we are modeling the very behavior we want him to stop. And why should he take the slightest notice of us if we know better than him at doing it? We're just doing it in a different situation. And it's no better there than anywhere else. Being pushy, being kind of trying to force my view on someone else. This isn't helpful.
And Paul, you're kind of leading into the next question. Is really the similar thing, but the other side of the coin is, in your experience, what are the catalysts for change in the groups, or the one-to-one or the group situation? So I seeing it from the facilitator's role in their engagement, but what have you noticed that really impacts in terms of change for the men that have gone through the programs at Ahimsa over the years?
Okay, again, I did write stuff down, so I thought, how on earth am I going to get all through this if I'm free-flowing in 45 minutes and allowing space for questions? So there are a number of different catalysts that change. It's not like there's one. It will depend on the person, and there might even be 2 or 3 during an individual person's process. So, number 1, getting the principle of responsibility. Someone gets it, it's like suddenly I'm in charge of my life, whereas before that, you thought all these people are doing it to me. But actually, I've been doing it to me. Massive if someone really gets that kind of being touched by an experience. It's a potential catalyst for change. Yeah, being touched, it's like suddenly something's got meaning as opposed to, well, I suppose it's a good idea I do this. It's like, whoa, actually, wow, yeah, this is important. That's getting the impact on partner and children. I mean, I get that really in a group, especially with other guys who've got further along, because we do rolling groups. So some guys have got much more talking about stuff, and suddenly guy gets, actually, they get it for themselves. That can have an impact. Catalyst for change. I mean, practice. I've got to say, it's a practice. Doing it and seeing that actually my life works better, not just everybody else's. That's a catalyst, which is a motivator. And essentially, people are going to change, they need motivation. It's like, it's not just I've got to do this because everybody else is saying it. It's like, actually, no, this is important to me. I need to do this for everybody else and for me, because I will feel better about it. Recognizing, if you like, patterns of their own behavior that's getting in the way of them, not just in their personal intimate relationship, but in other aspects of their life, defensive patterns. You know, reflecting that back and seeing what's the impact of that. Do you get what the impact of that? Do you think it's helpful to be that way? Again, sometimes that can be, and all of these things are what I'd call things that are happening generally, but somehow, at some moment, something clicks. It's not like you can say, oh, that always will be the one. It'll vary, and it will be varying in timing. What do I know? Actually, just the realization that it can change.
Sorry, Paul, the realization
Just
of...
the realization that he can change. And that's, again, where a group is helpful. Seeing other guys like him in a very different place, but quite openly acknowledging where they were in the beginning was like him. It's like, if they can do it, I can do it. That real, because a lot of them come in, well, yeah, this is who I am. Bring us to something else later on. But it is just recognize this is how you can be. It's not all of you. And you don't have to be this way. It's a choice. It's up to you. There's ways. Getting the difference between guilt and shame with some individuals, it's actually quite important because the shame gets in the way. The guilt opens the doors for change, really, and opens the doors for remorse. That can be for some individuals. And
Paul, can you say a bit more about that distinction between guilt and shame? And because I think that is quite a critical, and often the two get meshed, and it's unhelpful.
Yeah, so some guys getting that it's not okay what they're doing, and a lot of guys do get it's not okay, however defensive and whatever they are about it. There a lot of them get somehow this isn't really okay. When they take it on board more, they get into a shame place, which is really how terrible I am. There's no real thought for the impact on anybody else. It's still all about them. And they get identified. It's like, I am that behavior rather than that's a part of me. And they become much more paralyzed. It's a stuck place. And so they're not really receptive to anything there. It's kind of they'll stay in that place for a certain period of time, and then they'll get, it's so awful to stay there, they'll basically look to blame somebody else somewhere else. Well, if she hadn't done what she'd done, I wouldn't have done what I did. That's why I'm feeling it. So actually it's her fault. And the shame stuff just really is likely to reinforce abuse rather than change it. Whereas with guilt, it's like recognizing, what I did was not okay. It's a part of me and it's not all of me. A part of me does care, which is why I feel guilty. So, okay, so what do I need to do if I do care? Where do I build from that? I've got to build from a place of some part of me recognizes there's something good, because actually what we want is to cultivate that sense of goodness. I'm not telling him he's just bad. In that case, where's he going to go? And why would he be any different? It's kind of reinforces his own stuckness. So that sense of guilt, it's like much more about, okay, there's caring at the bottom of that. That's why I feel guilty. So what does that require me to do? And it's not just to change me, it's to be in whatever way is appropriate, and appropriate's the right word, that I'm kind of repairing to whatever extent I can meaningfully do at this point. And repairing can actually mean if a partner said, I don't want any contact, and he suddenly recognizes what he's done and he wants to apologize to her, it's not having any contact. Repairing isn't, I've got to do something. Sometimes it's actually, I respect what's being said and I stay with that. So, but that quality and that enables that's much more change oriented. It's much more thinking about the other, not just about me. Shame tends to be still all about me. And it's punitive as opposed to what I'd call looking to restore, looking to repair. Very different approach.
Thanks, Paul. Moving on then, because again, conscious of time, and
me too.
And this question, and maybe, so one thing is about whether this is important or not at all, but in terms of how we work with men, and often people are asking the question, what's at the root of behavior? And it'd be really interested to hear whether you think it's even of how much value it is to be doing this, because in the 14 years that I've been working here at the Men's Network and the men we've been working with, I can see that, for example, we still live in a society where there's a very significant gender inequality, and that's part of the social construct here in Ireland and in lots of places.
Yeah.
But then I also see that within that, then men are socialized in a certain way to have certain behaviors, to maybe avoid vulnerability, to feel they have to be isolated, stoic, and do everything on their own or whatever. And then we have very significant, a lot of work has been done recently about the significant impact of adverse childhood experiences, early childhood attachment issues, trauma issues.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious that the men that we work with, they have these in different proportions in their own life story. And I'm curious, how much of that do we need to know when we go into the room or care about, or how does it impact on the men in the room and the change process and enhancing safety of women and children?
Okay, I think we actually need to know a lot.
Okay.
Because attachment issues and trauma issues are much more of a foundation. Gender weaves into these, so things get played out. Attachment issues happen incredibly young. And that pattern, if you're insecurely attached, when things get difficult, and depending on the level of insecurity, etc., but when things get difficult, you basically want to control the situation, either by controlling the other people in your environment or by basically withdrawing. And the important thing about here, control, people often misthink control just means coercive and abusive. Actually, control can be just being pleasing. But you're still trying to control. You're not relating with the other person. You're trying to control them. And it's like we're talking about, if we're talking about relationships working, you've got to relate with each other. If you're just functioning from a pattern of kind of, I just need everything all right, one way or the other, whether it's coercively or pleasing, either way, it's dysfunctional. So to me, those are fundamental. That the fact that this work has so little recognition of that is a damning statement, because attachment is not some modern Western thing. You find it all over the world. So that I feel like should weave in. And it's not like this replaces gender. What drives me nuts is people saying it's gender or it's attachment or. It's not. It's all of this. It's how this weaves together. So attachment issues will be played out differently if you've got certain gender things, if you like, as you said before, expectations on there. So if you're a man who's basically, then the gender message is don't be vulnerable. So, well, the trouble with attachment is you get anxious if you're insecurely attached, especially if it's preoccupied, anxious, or if you're kind of disorganized, insecure. But you're not allowed to feel anxious. So what are you going to do? You're going to blame somebody else. You're going to control them. And when they get it wrong, it's all their fault. Because you don't actually have an ability, because you haven't learned that, to regulate your own emotion. So you're stirred up, but you can't regulate. And it's crucial that I can actually manage my anxiety and manage these feelings in myself. And often the anxiety sits above other vulnerable feelings, like really deep-seated grief and loss often. Yeah. So actually teaching that and recognizing that's part of the dynamic, because if you just think it's gender, even with the best will in the world, guys will still be functioning in a reactive, controlling, or placating, which won't actually go down well after a while. Because it might seem good for a bit, but actually after a while, it won't be good. You kind of spend time with someone who's just placating all the time and trying to please. It's not very interesting. It really isn't. So somehow seeing that, and I think the other element that was really important is, as you said, trauma, and having some understanding of the nervous system. If people have had anything that's traumatic enough, and we're not talking about PTSD, we're talking about traumatic enough, their nervous system will react in certain situations very quickly into fight, flight, or if it drops further down into resignation, kind of passivity, shutdown. Yeah, and that's got nothing to do with gender. That is their bodies will simply be doing that. Then they'll play it out, they'll explain it, they'll do a whole bunch of stuff around gender. But the gender stuff doesn't stop the process happening. They need to be able to understand the process. And how do they support that? How do they allow themselves to, okay, this is what's happening. How do I support and settle that anxiety, that reactivity, and just get myself in a place where I can relate again, where I can be a little more open? And this is crucial. And just having a gender belief that we should be equal. I mean, frankly, if you've worked with anyone in lesbian relationships, it becomes very clear the same dynamics run. It's not just gender. These things are much deeper than gender. But gender can give justification and explanation for behaviors that are clearly abusive and not okay. But it's like it's not enough just to think, oh, well, if you change all that, everything will be fine. Because I think the other thing that's often missed is, like, the gender kind of cultural viewpoint is pretty much, most of us will get that. Very few of us will have childhoods that aren't kind of infused with that in one way or another. Sure. Not everybody is abusive. I mean, or even the highest thing, kind of counts tend to be even in the range of 30-40%. Well, frankly, if it's gender, I would be expecting 90-95%.
Sure.
And it isn't. And I wouldn't expect lesbian relationships to be like, I'd expect, oh, well, those should be absolutely fine because they're not men. And we know these things aren't true. So it's again, but I kind of really want to emphasize, because there's such a wish to throw gender out there. And I'm not throwing gender out. I feel like the whole thing needs to fit together much more. It's more complex. Please don't simplify complex things, because we won't be successful if we do that. We want actually people to change. We want to support them to change. We want to support them to manage themselves better. We want to change their attitudes in certain ways, hope that can change. And if we're going to be successful at that, actually, we've got to engage with the reality of it rather than ideology, whatever that ideology might be.
Sure.
Therapy, no, gender's irrelevant, or all gender and therapy's irrelevant. It's actually, we're talking about human beings. We need to look at human responses, human patterns. Okay, off me soapbox.
No, that's really helpful, Paul. A couple of things that strike me. And we talked about the compliant men. I mean, this is often one of the most challenging men in a room to work with, because in a sense you're getting nothing back. You're getting, oh yes, I must do that, and I should have done that, and oh yeah, I see what you're saying. And there's a kind of a sense that it's just a habitual response that is really not getting into any real issues. It's a control, as you say. So I think knowing just that difficulty of going beyond that, knowing that that's just as controlling as more what looks like more obviously abusive control or coercive control. So look, that's really...
Yeah, and that element, oh, I should do this, I'd always, hang on. Do you want to do this? And if you do, how come you haven't done it before? What's getting in the way?
Yes.
Compliant guys can be challenged if you're kind of not going along with it, but kind of really, even the compliance can be, is in itself a kind of indication of something. It's very different from the guy who says, I should do this. And the guy who's kind of, God, yeah, I know I need to change.
Yeah.
And actually, the second one might actually be more challenging to work with, because he's stirred up by stuff so quickly and he's got more work to do. But this one is much less likely to change unless you can really engage with that.
Yeah, Paul, and coming on to this and I don't know, this is a really challenging question, I think, in a way, because there's no silver bullet answer to this, I know. But one of the things we often come up against in this work is we have agencies, like it could be social work, it could be other statutory agencies, saying, look, we have a man here, we're working with his partner, or we're working with him. We know there's domestic violence there, but it's very hard to engage him. He's not taking responsibility, and I know it's a difficult question, but in your experience, to get the man into that first step where he actually acknowledges something, it may not be the whole story, but I know people in the community, with the best will in the world, they want men to engage in a change process, but often getting them in over that first step to say, yes, I have an issue, and how to do that in a constructive way. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, coming back to questioning, so I would be always curious. So, for example, okay, you don't seem to say you've got a problem. So I'm curious, what happens like when there's a disagreement between you and your partner? What does that look like? And I'd be, if it's, we never have any disagreements, well, there's only two ways that's going to happen. You're either lying about it, or else one of you is totally dominating the other. I think I know which one that's going to be. Similarly, like, so I'm curious, but I'm assuming, like everybody else, at times you get angry, you get irritated by things. How do you behave? What's that look like? Yeah. And again, if there's a kind of, I never get that, you'd think, that doesn't sound very realistic. So maybe you don't notice you get like that. That's interesting. So you're kind of asking questions around, like, and if they've got any referrer sending them. Again, I always ask the question, so I'm here for the social services, whatever. What do you imagine they actually kind of sent you here? What do you imagine they see as a problem? But how do you relate to that? There's nothing at all in it. And again, how he is in the room is so crucial. because that's getting that defensiveness. There's just one little chink. I think part of the art of it is getting the opportunity. You know, even if there's some, well, I mean, you know, I might have a bit of a temper. Right, we're in, we've got, temper. I'm wondering what that looks like. What does a bit of a temper look like? Yeah, and what do you do? Not what goes on in your head just, but what do you do when you've got a bit of a temper? What's that actually look like for anybody else? But you're basically, in a way, I'd say for the agencies, this is something they can be doing. It's not, we're not imagining this is direct work for change. This is getting enough out in the open that maybe do you think it'd be a good idea to do something around that? Do you actually think that's a problem? And any contradictions, if he says one thing one moment and another the next, I'd always be bringing, that's interesting. Do you realize you said this 5 minutes ago? And now you're saying this complete opposite. Something doesn't sit here with me. Tell me, how do you make sense of that? But again, you bring it back to him. You bring it back to him. Yeah. And it's not going to work with everybody, but you're more likely to elicit some response from some of them. And you've got the first point of maybe they'll now come along to the program for an assessment. Yeah. And you've got facilitators who are more skilled at even doing more of that.
Yeah. And I think what I'm really hearing is that it's really you're reflecting back and asking questions and being curious again. So rather than coming with an agenda or a kind of solution or a judgment or interpretation, it's reflecting back. How is that? What does that look like? How is that for you? And the discrepancies between one thing and another. So in a sense, you're engaging the man right from the start in a self-reflective process. So he's doing the work, you're feeding some questions and reflections, but so I kind of get that sense.
Yeah. And I think an important bit in there is I'm listening to him rather than judging him. When people feel listened to, they tend to say a little more. When people feel judged, they tend to say as little as possible. So again, that you're kind of encouraging more to come out rather than kind of, well, we know you did this. What do you say about it? I mean, it's just offensive and 100 reasons why it wasn't the way that someone else is saying it is.
Yeah, and that feels to me a bit of a strand through what we're saying, that even though we all have a certain agenda, we're there for a reason, but somehow dropping that so that you're giving space for the man to come forward. You're not just driving an agenda, but you have an agenda, but you're leaving space, you know, for the man to step into that, rather than you stepping into his space, as it were. You're in much more. Anyway, repeating myself a bit there, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I'm looking for the opportunity to step in where there's some receptivity, rather than I'm going to just jump in. I'm just going to meet defensiveness, so I'm not going to get anywhere. So it's like the agenda I've got is I need to open this to see if there's something that he's going to reveal that gives me a way in. Otherwise, I'm just beating my head against the wall. I'm not getting anywhere, and I can be saying all the right things, but it's not getting anywhere. So how's that helpful? It's certainly not making anyone safer.
Yeah. No, I get that. Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Paul. And moving along, and I'm conscious that there are some questions coming in. I'm conscious there are some maybe very specific questions that we may need to take time with later that may not come into this discussion, but we'll see where we go. But one of the things that I've was struck with in your work from a good while back is that I felt that you've anticipated certain changes in the work that are now probably in the general area. They've been integrated, but I think you were there quite quickly. And it is around this bringing in what would appear to be spiritual practices in the work in terms of mindful awareness and inquiry. Let me just give my own bias on that, because I was very struck by, long years ago, a line by Albert Einstein, who said a problem can't be solved at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. So my sense is around sustainable change, that something has to happen that brings us almost to a new place, not just trying to work hard from where we are to change, but actually some shift. And I feel that spiritual practices have always been about that, around shift that is sustainable in some way. How, for people who may be listening in or attending and maybe a bit skeptical about that, or saying, what's this, we're in here to make men accountable,
Can't hear you, John.
And here, well, you will hold the issues of holding men accountable and making women and children safe. How do you integrate spiritual practices, and why would you do that, maybe?
Okay. So, I mean, spiritual practices is the whole point. It's a practice and it's not a belief. So it's got nothing to do with any particular religious system. These are practices that have been there a lot longer than Western psychology in terms of, so if I'm taking mindfulness, certain aspects of mindfulness are used in the work from day one, but certain people have always used basic grounding, calming techniques. And whether they call it mindfulness or not doesn't matter. It's more like that's seen as if someone's agitated, you need them to settle down. And how do you do that? You go into their body and ground them, because any other way is less likely to make enough of a difference. So another aspect of, if I like, mindfulness, which I find really helpful, is one of the things that I said before. It's recognizing this is a part of you, it's not all of you. It's like this is, because sometimes guys will say it's not really me, and I always say, yes, it is you, but it's a part of you. There's more than that, but there is that. This isn't something you're going to get rid of. This is something you've got to learn to work with, relate with, manage, so you're not acting it out. And again, that I think one of the other elements that helps all of that in mindfulness is you're kind of grounding, you've got a little more space around the experience. If I don't have space around the experience and I'm just totally locked in it, I literally don't see choice. Everybody else can see, he's got loads of choices, but in that moment, it's like, this is it, there's nothing else I can do. Create a bit of space, and actually you can see, actually there are possibilities. Yeah. So the fact that I don't see choice doesn't mean I'm not responsible, but the truth is, if I want the man to change, he's got to be able to see the choice for himself, and the spaciousness is helpful. So I find all of those are, if you like, basic, coming out of a simplified mindfulness, if you like. And I feel like whatever you're doing from spiritual practices need to fit in with the way we're working. Don't just bring them in, you know, just in their entirety. It's got to fit in some way. I mean, the other element that feels really quite crucial is when I talk about the heart. You know, this quality of open or closed, it feels really crucial. And the heart is ultimately, it's like, I'm open, I'm more touched, I'm more willing, I'm more receptive. And sometimes I'm not open, I'm closed. Seeing the difference is what's important. I always say to the guys, when you are closed, you have nothing intelligent to say about relationship. And by the way, nor do I when I'm closed. It's like we don't. We're just in a position and we're just trying to make a point. When I'm open, it's like, okay, it's inclusive. It's me and you. And this is really important. It's not just you, it's not just me, it's me and you. That inclusivity feels really crucial. And again, my experience has been there are certain approaches, primarily Eastern approaches, because they're the ones I'm more familiar with as a practice, that kind of encourage that have got more encouragement in terms of the kind of reflection and being aware of those. And I think the other element that in all what I'd call all spiritual practices that I know of in all cultures are grounded in love. That's quite fundamental as far as I'm concerned, you know. And it's drawing on that. But it's really about, it's the word in spiritual practice that I kind of really want to emphasize is practice. And this work is a practice. And if you like, that's where I diverge a bit, if you like, from standard therapy. A lot of standard therapy, not all of it, but a lot of it isn't a practice. It's experiential, and over time, things may change and you may feel better, but it's not giving you practice. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to practice. And not just briefly, as we say to the guy, it's a practice for the rest of your life. Practice. And I find that I've always found very helpful. I drew on that as a real focus from spiritual practice. And, you know, I trained originally as a psychotherapist. But I know when I worked as a psychotherapist, I didn't kind of push the practice element in the way that I would be really insistent, saying, look, if this is going to work, you have to practice it. These are like having, I mean, the guys will often use the expression tools in a toolbox. And they can say, yeah, if you don't get the tools out, they don't work. You need to be doing it. You need to be putting it into practice. It's no good being here and learning what the tools are if you're not practicing them. And unless you practice, you don't get familiar. If you don't get familiar, old patterns will always kick in stronger. because you're actually needing to practice because you're trying to change a very familiar way of behaving into a different way. Well, that won't happen with just an insight. Important. Insight isn't enough. Practice of, okay, how do I do this different? How do I work with this? And then how do I deal with the difficulties I find when I do practice it? Because actually when you do practice it, some things go very well and some things are really hard. So all of that for me is like I've found I've drawn on in those ways.
Yeah, and that really rings true what you're saying about insight, Paul, because it's amazing to me how many of the men even arrive to us with insight. For example, they have something like they say, I swore I'd never become like my father.
Yes.
But and their desire is not to repeat the past, but they're still doing that. And I think that suggests that it is not something that just having an insight will sustain change, but something, a more deeper experience. And that, as you say, commitment to practice, so that you're developing something new, a new response.
Because I think you're right. Some of the men will exactly come in with that, but they don't know how to make it different. They know they don't want to be this way, but they don't really know how to be different. And I've said this before, but I kind of would just always want to emphasize it. The two most common statements guys who really have engaged in the program will say is, why don't they teach us this at school? And this is really about growing up. And they're right. It's about becoming an adult rather than kind of sulky, tantrum throwing child. And it's about actually being taught things at a much earlier age and how you manage stuff, because they're not going to get it at home every time. It'd be wonderful if we all got that at home, but our parents, half of us, they're no more skilled than we are in these respects. And that's no criticism. It's just recognizing that hasn't been brought into their lives. If you don't actually have any kind of possibility of knowing it, you may know I shouldn't do this, but God, the amount of guys who've said that and still carry on doing it. But it's like people, I shouldn't smoke cigarettes, it's killing me, but that doesn't mean it's going to stop smoking.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Bob. I'd like to bring Mark back in at the moment to see how we're doing, because I'm not really tracking. I can't do both those two things, it seems.
No problem at all. We're having a lot of comments and just lots of hellos from a wide range of people across the country who are working in a lot of the services. But we have 7 different questions, and obviously we won't get around to all of these now because time is ticking on, but you can also type a response from either Paul or John, or indeed if there are other people here attending who would like to answer, they can go into the Q&A section and answer. So I'll just go through a few. We've got a lady from Belfast who's joined us for a few webinars before. She has 3 different questions. What drives a man to sexually abuse a stepdaughter or his own daughter? She also asks, can an inferiority complex in a man lead him to domestic and gender-based violence? And then I suppose finally, can educating men be enough to produce a turnaround? From Fionnuala Collins, we have on receptivity, dropping the agenda that you might have come in with for getting through the program to respond to what's in the room. What about when facilitators bring something into the room that they may not be aware of, like a need to direct the group energy or be in control of who says what when? Where are the boundaries around that? And is there a skill that can be taught, or is it an intuitive kind of thing? We have our own Martin Doheny from MEND who asks, what challenges do you see in the work with the COVID-19 pandemic? And we also then have Sean asking, you have mentioned the impact of working in the group. How important is group work in working with perpetrators? And finally, Lisa Marmion has asked, Paul, can you talk a little bit about working with non-physical abuse, please? Control, coercion, intimidation, those type of things rather than direct violence. Now, I know there's a lot, so, maybe you can pick maybe 3 out of them and maybe then when you have the time to kind of answer written to maybe some of the others.
Okay, so just facilitation, just really clear. The facilitators are in charge of running the group always. So you really need to be in charge of where it's going. Yeah. So in terms of allowing things to unfold, it's really to be clear. At a certain point, you need to stop that. Something is going on. If things are going off the agenda, you stop. Say, what's happening here? I'm aware we've all gone off. If someone's getting reactive, you kind of just focus on getting them calm and looking at what went on. I mean, so I think really important to get the difference between dropping an agenda that isn't relevant to the moment and dropping the agenda full time. You're not dropping it full time. You're just getting right now what we're dealing with in the moment is anyway part of the bigger agenda. Someone's actually in reaction, if someone's actually behaving in a way that's not appropriate or shut down, that is part of the agenda. This is how these people are in their relationships. But you're coming, so it's not like you're dropping it. This is the idea about being flexible and fluid. It's actually your agenda isn't rigid. You can shift to what's here that you need to deal with, because dealing with anything else in that moment isn't going to go anywhere. But it's not like we're throwing that out. We then need to bring it back in. And in truth, I think it's not just intuitive. It's understanding what's needed and practice. And I think part of that's the guidance with supervision, that's guidance with training, that's guidance where you've always got two facilitators anyway, which is really helpful because you speak to each other and you can talk about when you have a difficult session. Everybody will have at times a difficult group session you want to reflect back on and see what happened there. So it's a learning. It's not about getting everything right 100% all the time, because nobody ever does. Okay. That's probably enough on that one question. There's a lot more I could say, but I know there's a number of other questions. Now I've got to remember them because there was about 7 or 8 of them there.
There were 7. So I suppose just to say to all our attendees, you can vote on these questions. So you know, if we get a chance, I know there's 2 that have got an uptick vote already. Fanula had one. Sorry, Fanula had one. You just answered that. We have Sean. Has got 2 votes. So you have mentioned the impact of working in the group. How important is group working in working with perpetrators?
Okay, I think group work is enormously helpful, and it's not absolutely essential. This feels so crucial. Yeah, that actually you can do good work on a one-to-one level. You can do good work as we have been doing during the lockdown. We've had no group work in lockdown. We've been doing everything via Skype, via Zoom, occasionally even by phone when someone hasn't got any other way of doing it. So, but the value of group work is the way, and if a group is working really well, the way the more experienced men will influence the others. And at the same time, the other value is in any group situation, kind of on an emotional level, everything gets a little more intense. People can drop a little deeper if you're working that way. But the other side of that is there's a kind of resistance collectively not to go deeper. But if you've got the skill to bring it down, that there's a level to which actually people just drop and the whole group drops. And those things I don't think you can get so easily. You can get them, but you don't get, well, clearly you don't get the influence of other men when you're doing one-to-one work. But if you're looking at the essence of what the work is about, you can do one-to-one work as well as group work, because if you're talking about people who are really isolated in a rural situation, there's no way they can get to a group, or where there is no group nearby, the nearest group is like 100 miles away. It's like they're not going to be able to get there. There needs to be more flexibility. So you can do one-to-one. My preference is group work. I'm very clear, but I also really have always viewed one-to-one work is really helpful prior to group work, because in one-to-one work, you get the individual's particular patterns and focus. We've got some idea of that before he goes into the group. Plus, he's got some of the basics in place, which means if we do challenge them, the basics have been done. And then the question is, how come you're not using them?
Okay. We have Lisa has got 2 votes. Can you talk a little bit about working with non-physical abuse, please?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'd say most of the work is about working with non-physical abuse. Stopping violence is a lot more simple in one sense than stopping all the other stuff, because all the controlling, more intimidating and kind of cutting, nasty comments, all of that kind of stuff is generally much more work to get people to drop that, and just looking at the attitude towards a partner. So, and that's the kind of stuff that comes out particularly when guys are speaking about partners, when they're speaking about situations. I find that they will invariably, the majority of them will come from a resentful place at times. We just want to go straight into that. They'll come from a blaming place. They'll come from an expectation. And in terms of intimidation, this is really helpful in a group, because you get one guy getting stirred up, you bring him down, and then you ask the rest of the guys, what was that like? And then you can bring in, well, that was like for you, and you're sitting in a group with half a dozen other guys, plus 2 facilitators, and none of it was aimed at anybody in the room. It was all kind of someone getting stirred up talking about something else. What do you think that would be like when it's aimed at a partner on her own in one room? So, and no one's hit anybody. This is like scary. And actually getting, even when you're not even directed at you, it's scary as hell, which really is helpful for the guys to get, even when you're saying, yeah, well, I didn't aim at her, I just punched the wall. It's like, yeah, but get how scary that is when you're actually in the presence of that, especially if it's just you in the room. So to me, the answer would be, this is the major part of the work. It really is.
Following on from a bit of that, we have Deirdre Barrett asking, can you say something about when men in the room collude with each other? Do you encounter that much? Or how do you deal with it?
Well, you challenge it straight away, but you kind of do it from a way of, I'm curious what's going on here. I mean, when you collude with each other, I mean, so if they're colluding with each other overtly, then it's very straightforward because they're saying something and say, woo, what's going on? I'm curious. And my general view would be I'd take one of them to start with, not both of them. What was going on when you said that? I'm curious where that's coming from. Yeah? Because when we're talking about collusion, I'm assuming we're talking about collusion in the sense of, I'm guessing that, you know, they're kind of agreeing with a guy's blaming, with a guy's poor me, victimization, all this kind of stuff. And you kind of just stop that. But the final question would always be, if I've got this person just to get that, you know, actually, yeah, okay, yeah, well, I was not helpful. That was going on in him. You think, how helpful was that for I don't know, Joe, when you're doing that? For Joe to change, how helpful is that comment for Joe if he wants to change? And again, a group is great because even if the guy is kind of a bit reluctant to, what do you guys think? It's generally, it really isn't helpful. So you engage with it directly. You don't hang about. You engage with it in the room. Again, that's what I'm saying about that fluid kind of approach to process. It's like, forget the agenda right now. We've just gone off it, and what we've gone off on is a problem. So let's get to the problem. Then we come back.
I'm conscious, Mark and Paul, of the time.
We are starting to take on, but to be fair to Dicky Lady, she had 3 questions and we didn't get to any of them. So the one that's had the most votes is, can educating men be enough to produce a turnaround, or does it take more? Okay.
Very simple answer to that. No. Educating boys will make a turnaround. Not educating men. Educating boys. And that is what will make the difference when you start to shift into recognizing this needs to be done as young as, basically it should be happening at school. These kind of things, as I say, which is the feedback I get, you know, from guys, the most common feedback. So, and it's not that educating men won't make some difference to the people around them. But if we're talking about a real turnaround, you've got to do this in the schools. You've got to start young. And it's not like that will stop everything, but it could change the general orientation to a different perspective. And then you've got, rather than fair amount of abuse in a cultural kind of slightly reinforcing it, you'd have incidents of abuse, but it's not supported by the culture as a whole in the same way. It's not, then they're all coming from the same place. And that would be very different. And of course, we're nowhere near that yet, unfortunately. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it's really good. It's one of the things we focus in White Ribbon Ireland is we're working on a schools pack, you know, because get them while they're younger to change those attitudes earlier. It's
absolutely, yeah. I'm working with the result, but if you really want to do the best work, it's going to be in school. That's not my...
Prevention is better than cure, you know, this, an old saying.
Put me out of work by all means, but at the moment, that's not likely to happen.
Now it is gone 6 past 2, so I don't know if you want to wrap up, and what we can do is we can stay on and maybe address some of the other questions if people want to do that. But just to allow people, because their lunch hour is...
well, I'm very conscious of not wanting to keep people too long, Mark. So yeah, people can stay if they have some further, or we want to answer the questions. But in the meantime, I just really want to thank everybody for turning up and for the level of interest, comments and questions. It really felt like people were engaging very, very well. And to thank Paul, of course, for giving of his time and his experience, and that's been great. And Mark, for your support behind the scenes, as it were. So thanks everyone for coming and joining us, and hopefully there'll be more sessions of this nature into the future. And anybody who wants to stay for those questions, we can stay on for a bit, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say to everyone, I've put in the link here in the chat bar, just a link to subscribe to our newsletter if you want to keep informed about when the videos come out, coming events in the future, and just other ongoing work that we're doing. We won't be spamming you by any measure, about roughly once a month or less.
Yeah. Can I just say, like, I mean, again, my thanks. I'm happy to stay on, no problem with that. But just to say, I mean, I thank John inviting me to do this. Thank you, Mark, for supporting this in your technical way, which is way beyond mine. And I'd just like to thank everybody who tuned into it, because I appreciate you being interested enough to listen to the likes of me. But no, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, you want any more questions?
So yeah, I just wanted to give a gap there for a minute so we can, yeah. So yeah, there were 9. I know that Fanula gave us a second one, which is more a comment than a question, and it's on gender and poor attitudes to women. So we can't change men; they can change themselves, but we can support them to change their attitudes. If not through ideology, how can we enter this space as women facilitators to listen to men with openness, where the subtext and underlying attitudes can be quite hurtful or offensive if the men want to speak over us or have a misogynist vibe? And in compassionate inquiry and facilitation in this context requires us to listen with several parts of ourselves at once. But we got to be aware of our vulnerabilities and our, judge and feel safe enough to challenge that. And it can be quite difficult. And as we've seen here today, I can tell you, I mean, it's a thing we constantly hear in talking about domestic violence is, where are the men? And I know, your men leading this, and I know in MDN we're very strong and passionate about it. But again, the participants, there was only about 6 men. All the rest are women, and most of them are working in the services. So I suppose it is a real challenge. Men do talk over women. They don't even have to be abusers. You see it in every political show going and everything. And how to kind of deal with that, I suppose, while taking care of yourself as such, but also trying to do the work. It does pose an extra question, doesn't it?
Well, I think that element of self-care is really, really crucial. But I mean, okay, one thing that feels really important is your co-facilitator is really important here. It's really important that they are really alongside you. That my experience generally is the groups as a whole don't function that way. It's more 1 or 2 individuals will, and then what'll happen is other guys will be behind you as well. Yeah. If the group is working well. That's been at Ahimsa the way we work. That seems to be the case. It's not like someone will never be like that, but it's much less to be likely to be a collective thing. And looking at that, I mean, the vulnerability is a good one to name. If you like, I need to be as a facilitator, whatever facilitation I'm doing, I need to recognize that I'm emotionally sensitive. I'll be hurt by certain things, but I also need to be emotionally resilient. And actually, it's really important that I'd say for the men there to get, I can be hurt and I'm still here and I can still do what I need to do. And you can do the same. You don't need to get abusive. You don't need to behave badly. So, but I mean, there's a certain element in this. I'm not a woman in a group of men like this. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying what I can say, but please don't take it that therefore I'm the font of wisdom on this, because I wouldn't pretend to be. I think it's really other female facilitators will probably be able to give you a little more advice.
If there's any woman facilitator on here, if you want to just say in the chat bar your name, if you wanted to speak about this, I can promote you in to come live on camera if you want to just chat around that a little bit. I'll give someone a minute or two for people if anyone wants to volunteer on that. But while we're waiting for that, We have Martin, I can see, is still with us just at the moment. So his question was, and I'm sure it's on everyone's tip of their tongue, is what challenges do you see in the work with COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I guess the biggest challenge is you can't do face-to-face work, Howard. So, I mean, as I said, so at Ahimsa, for example, we shut the office on the day lockdown happened, 24th of March, and we have not done any, if you like, face-to-face with an individual in the room since then. But we work with Skype, we work with Zoom, so we work with phone. So the challenge has been to just continue. So, I mean, what we've done with the groups that were happening, me and Amy, my co-facilitator for the two groups we're running, we split the groups 50-50 between us to do one-to-one work. And we still would work in the same way. And the advantage, I mean, there's my preference is always group work, but the one thing you've got with one-to-one work, you've got a whole hour focused on one person. There's an awful lot you can do in an hour with someone when you've given that focused time. There's much less place they can't hide to start with. Yeah, it's like, so, but I mean, I think the challenge is if you're kind of working from a manualized, kind of more rigid way, I can see that's going to be more difficult. If you're working in a more process-oriented way, working with what's in front of you, it's completely doable. It is completely doable. And from our point of view, it's actually opened the doors to a thought, well, okay, we could do some more of this with guys who are never able to get to us because they're just too far away. It's opened the possibility of doing these things. I mean, actually, for Ahimsa, we haven't got the resources to do to open up that way, but to recognize actually this is very doable in a way elsewhere. I think the biggest challenge that I hear is really that the workers have some time to spend time together on a kind of like a Zoom chat room quite regularly, because the isolation can be an issue. You really, what I hear with places I supervise is what they miss is the colleagues. They miss that I'm in a place where I've got colleagues I can just chat to, I can just talk to if something's difficult. And I think that's a challenge in that respect.
Yeah, no, it's sorry, I thought it was a comment, but it was just there's been a lot of thanks coming in, and one is just someone who's just leaving there, but wants to just thanks for generous and warm insights to you, Paul, and really good to know for many people working in I suppose domestic and gender-based violence at the deepest levels, just really helpful. So there's a lot of comments like that, but I might just return to Dick Lady, and again, the offer is there if there is anyone who's working in the fields, and particularly a female voice that wants to maybe share a few insights, more than welcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we're kind of in informal phase now, so there's no there's no pressure. We won't be. Well, the initial conversation between the two guys will be going up in video later. This part won't, so you're safe as such. But I suppose, in fairness to Dick Lady, who's joined so many of our webinars so far, she did have two other questions, and I'm not sure if they're all necessarily appropriate to answer. But can an inferiority complex in a man lead him to domestic and gender-based violence? And then the other one was, which I'm not sure we can answer today, but what drives a man to sexually abuse a stepdaughter or his own daughter? Which is slightly, I suppose, a different tangent, but probably somehow related, I guess.
I mean, I guess to actually answer in the most simplistic way, the second question, total lack of empathy, total selfishness, and kind of it's all about getting what I want, and actually the consequence is irrelevant as far as the damage it does to anybody else. I mean, that's pretty, serious, if you like. Well, it's very serious in terms of the sheer indifference for a guy to do that in the context of that. But it's all about me. That's the problem. All about me, and nobody else matters. The second question, which is, or the book was the way you put them the other way around, Mark.
Yeah, sorry.
So, because the first question also could open up into a lot more than that. But I'm just keeping it really dead simple at the most simplistic level. My mind's just gone blank. Could you remind me?
Inferiority complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can that lead to,
Okay. An inferiority complex does not in itself lead anybody to be abusive. That's the first thing to put on the table. However, if I feel inferior and part of me thinks I shouldn't be, then what happens is it feeds the opposite. It feeds a sense of self-importance. And self-importance definitely can lead to abusive behavior. It leads to entitlement, it leads to expectations, it leads to basically a sense of feeling betrayed if you're not validated for how important you are, as opposed to I'm just disappointing that I'm kind of not being valued. It becomes something else. So I think it's not the inferiority complex itself, it's when that then feeds a kind of self-importance compensation. That will very likely, I would say, almost always lead to some kind of abusive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That's,
I think that probably answers a whole lot of that, you know, Little Englander, Sergeant Major, Brexiteer, or even, as we're seeing in America, this kind of refashioned kind of alt-right or neo-fascist and kind of white supremacist kind of thinking. It's coming possibly from a place, what you're saying there, potentially, along with a whole range of other stuff. But
yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff supporting it, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, it becomes, why on earth, if you're feeling good enough about yourself and you don't need to be self-important, why on earth would you do anything like that to anybody?
Yeah. We do have another question that has come in. Paula has asked, it would be interesting to know how we engage with traveller men, or I suppose, you know, Roma, or I don't know, are they called travellers in England, or are they, you know, gypsies, or what are they called in England?
They tend to be travellers rather than
Travellers
gypsies.
as well, yeah, okay. Yeah. Is there a kind of particular angles, or a kind of a slightly different method?
I don't think the approach is necessarily different. I mean, what you would be relatively limited experience. We work with some travellers, but it's not the main bulk of who we work with in Plymouth by any means. Is you've got there's often a very macho culture, very macho in that sense. So you've got the kind of gender belief seem far more rigid in some respects, and the kind of acceptance of violence is greater. I mean, again, we're talking about the guys who are coming in, so of course that would be the case with them. That's why they're coming to see us. That doesn't mean all travellers are like that, but it's like the ones who come to see us seem to be much more from that mindset. But it's the same work. It's the same work. I think the real issue, if you're talking about what would be different with travellers, is if they're travelling, it would be a good example. Well, they probably aren't going to be able to come to a group in the same place every week, but they could do one-to-one work via Zoom, via Skype, because actually my experience is almost everyone seems to have these, what do they call them, smartphones. I'm one of the few I know who doesn't, but it's like, but I noticed that with the guys I work with, that some of them are, they're basically having the session on their phones rather than on a computer screen, because that seems to be but I think the essence of the work isn't going to be any different. Probably the biggest question is in terms of their own support for themselves. If they're living in a community where what they're doing is really at odds with it, how they manage that, how they look after themselves in that setting. But again, it's going to depend, because travellers are like everybody else. They're various different people. Different camps will be different anyway. And even within camps, there'll be guys who aren't like that. It's like, it's not as simplistic in a sense. But the essence of the work, to me, it doesn't matter who you're working with or where you're working with from. The issues are going to be the same in terms of violence is not okay, the abuse is not okay, the expectations and entitlement's not okay, etc., etc.
That's all our questions, and no one has volunteered. I know that we have Fanula from Move Ireland, so I presume she's done a good bit of facilitation work, and we have
Fanula's question.
Yeah, no, we had two questions from her, and I think they've been answered. But you know, it's just purely if anyone wants to join us to have a short chat or say hello or share a. I know I've but no one seems to have volunteered in the. Oh, here we go.
Somebody.
Thank you very much for the fruitful webinar. No volunteers. So
thank you.
I've got to give a countdown of 5, and if you want to come on and have a chat, we're very welcome, because there's still 14 attendees here. So going once, going twice, going 3 times. Here we have a chat bar. unfortunately need to leave you. Many thanks. So, okay. I think it is about time. It's 1:20. We've had a really good long session. Thank you all for your attendance and your patience and your questions, and also the work that you all do is a really vital work out there in the communities, keeping people safe and working with people. John, I'll leave you with the last word.
Oh, yeah, well, just again, for those of you who are still here, thank you for staying the course. And it's been really a great session for me, and just really enlivening and encouraging and supportive. I think what is really helpful in engaging with Paul is there's this sense of possibility. So the sense change is possible, and that there is a challenge of how we engage and how we get out of the way, get out of our own ways, if you like. So look, I'm grateful to have that encouragement again for the work, and I hope that's been of some support to those of you out there, whether it's working with victim survivors, children, or working with men. I hope the session has been of nourishment and support to go back into that work. So again, thanks everyone, thanks Paul, and I think we'll leave it there.